My name is Dr. Thomas Webb. I am a doctor working in Australia, working across the fields of general medicine in a hospital, but also longevity and sports medicine. I've actually had the privilege of working with a lot of high-performing professionals, entrepreneurs, CEOs as part of a longevity company and improving their health, energy, recovery. But the reason I'm making this video isn't because I've studied burnout or know the theory. It's mainly because I've lived through it myself as a burnt out medical doctor. And actually 2 years ago, despite understanding health, performance professionally, my own life was becoming increasingly chaotic behind the scenes. My routines had fallen apart, my attention span was terrible, my dopamine system was completely overstimulated, and I felt like I was constantly fighting against myself. Eventually, I found myself living in a van during what I can only describe as a complete internal reset period. And what's interesting is that if you'd met me during that time, you probably wouldn't have called it burnout. From the outside, I still had parts of my life held together. I was still operating at a high level, still turning up to work, deeply caring about my future, my career, and still had ambitions and goals that I wanted to achieve. That didn't leave me. That wasn't the problem. The strange part was that despite all of this, I wasn't really moving forward. I felt stuck. I felt overwhelmed. I felt like I was carrying a level of mental and emotional weight that I couldn't quite explain. And no matter how hard I tried to push through it, things never seemed to improve for very long. And that's exactly why I think physician burnout, specifically doctor burnout, is so misunderstood, because most doctors imagine burnout as a dramatic collapse. They picture somebody who can no longer work, somebody who's completely broken down, somebody who's reached a point where functioning has become impossible. And maybe actually from the outside, if I was living in a van, maybe you could say it looked a bit like that. But actually, in my experience, I was still operating at a high level, still had big ambitions, and actually working personally with doctors as well. That's rarely how burnout starts. More often, what it looks like is it feels like you're kind of becoming slightly a worse version of yourself slowly every month, kind of insidiously over time for several years even, and you don't suddenly lose your ability to work. Instead, you start noticing that these things require more effort than they used to. You finish shifts feeling more drained than the workload seems to justify. Your focus becomes less reliable. Your recovery between busy periods becomes worse, and the level of enthusiasm you once had for medicine, for being a doctor, slowly kind of erodes over time and fades into this obligation, this sense of responsibility. And because these changes happen gradually, most people adapt to them. You tell yourself you've just had a difficult rotation, or you tell yourself it's just part of the job. You tell yourself this is justified sacrifice, and it's not about you, it's about your patients. But actually, are you really doing your patients a favor if you're turning up to work feeling exhausted, feeling shattered, and not actually enjoying the job? So you convince yourself that this is simply what medicine feels like. Before you realize it, you've spent years operating below your actual capacity, your potential. And one of the biggest misconceptions about burnout is that it's primarily a psychological problem, because people assume they're struggling because they're not resilient enough, disciplined enough, or mentally tough enough. But after working with both doctors and high-performing entrepreneurs, executives, I've become convinced that burnout is much more physiological than most people realize. To understand why, we need to talk about something called chronic stress. When most people think about stress, they think about feeling overwhelmed before an exam, a difficult conversation, or a particularly demanding shift. But that's not the type of stress that I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is the cumulative effect of spending months or years operating in an environment that continuously demands attention, decision-making, responsibility, and emotional regulation without providing enough opportunities for genuine recovery. The problem here is your nervous system wasn't designed to remain switched on all the time. The sympathetic nervous system, which if you're watching this, you probably know what that is. It's the part of your nervous system responsible for alertness, focus, performance under pressure. And this is very useful, of course, when you're on shift, when you're in the hospital, because this allows you to operate at these high levels of stress. This allows you to get the best out of yourself in these short periods of time. But the problem here is that once this ends, once that met call ends, once that emergency ends, or once that shift ends, you want to be able to down-regulate so you're not constantly exerting cortisol, adrenaline in your body. Because if you're not switching off after work, if you're not separating your work and your other life, then you're going to be constantly in this high alert, chronic stress level. And that eventually is going to lead to you feeling drained, feeling burnt out. One concept that helped me understand this is something called cognitive load. Cognitive load is essentially the amount of mental processing your brain is performing throughout the day. Every decision you make, every patient interaction, every interruption, every unfinished task sitting in the back of your mind. So imagine going home from a shift thinking of 5 or 6 things you have to do the next day. They're running in the back of your mind. You're not able to fully switch off because these loops are open. They're still bothering you. They're still causing stress, even if you're not aware of it. And if you take this cognitive load with you for all parts of your life, it's always going to be there. It's always going to contribute to this sense of stress. And if you have these open loops, it's easy to not be aware of them. It's easy to assume you're just tired, or that you're just lazy, or maybe you're just getting older and this is just part of life. In reality, many of these guys, these doctors, are simply trying to operate under an unsustainable mental burden for far too long. Now, obviously, this is something I go much deeper into inside my program. If you want personalized help to work through your specific bottlenecks, then we can talk about that and see if you're a good fit in the call link in the description. But the goal here isn't simply to feel better temporarily, it's to understand the root causes behind these patterns so that doctors stop cycling between brief periods of recovery and recurring burnout, and instead build a level of energy, resilience, and performance that actually lasts. So how do you start fixing it? The first thing I would do is not to focus on productivity, it's actually recovering successfully. Because most burnt out doctors don't have a productivity problem, they have a recovery problem. They have an inability to down-regulate their nervous system after a shift. And that's a huge difference because many people think they're recovering, but they're actually not. They're spending evenings scrolling on their phone, watching content, sitting in front of Netflix, and assume that's recovery. That's not recovery, that's just distraction. That's distraction from what's going on in the background. Your open loops, the stress, the worry that you have. Real recovery requires periods where the nervous system can actually down-regulate, where it can move away from constant stimulation and begin returning closer to a baseline of calmness, of peace. And that's one of the reasons something as simple as walking can be so powerful. Not because walking is magical, not because walking is the best thing for longevity or for health, Walking can create an environment where the nervous system finally gets a chance to slow down. It creates a barrier and resistance to your work, to the distractions that might come up, and gives you an excuse to just slow down, to process your thoughts, and to actually create a sense of calmness. One of the first things you'll notice when recovery starts improving is that you stop waking up feeling like you never really even slept in the first place. The number of hours might not even change dramatically at first, but the quality of recovery does. You'll wake up feeling more refreshed, experience fewer energy crashes throughout the day, and find yourself relying less heavily on things like caffeine just to feel functional at work. And gradually you start feeling more like yourself again, that identity that you used to have outside of medicine, outside of being a doctor, because now you're learning to separate when you're switched on at a shift and when you finish your shift, and you can actually down-regulate and go into a different identity. Because you're not just a doctor at the end of the day. And I want you to internalize that. It's not about becoming more productive or more disciplined or work harder, but rebuilding the physiological and psychological foundations that allow you to perform well without constantly sacrificing yourself in the process. And that's exactly what I wish somebody had explained to me 2 years ago. And I will be uploading detailed videos on how you can rediscover your life and career after a physician burnout every single week. And not just about overcoming burnout, because that's a bit boring. Also about how you can get to that high level, operate as a high performer, and keep at that level. But if you'd like to work with me directly, you'll find details in the description, and I will see you on the next one.